So this is case 43 from a case koan book that's called the Denko Roku. So I'm going to read you the case and then I'm going to give you a little bit of background. And some of us are going to know more about this than others, but most of us, I think, maybe might not know a whole bunch about it. So I want us to be sort of operating from some shared sense of background information. So this is the case, and it's Ryozan Enkin. The 42nd patriarch was Ryozan Enkin. He studied with Doan Kanshi and served him. Doan Kanshi asked him, "What is the business beneath the patch robe?" The master had no answer. Doan Kanshi said, "Studying the Buddha way and still not reaching this realm is the most painful thing. Now you ask me." The master asked, "What is the business beneath the patch robe?" And Doan Kanshi said, "Intimacy." And upon hearing that, the master was greatly enlightened, greatly awakened. It's a better way to put it. So, the Denko Roku is the subtitle is The Record of Transmitting the Light. And it's a collection of koans that go back to Shakyamuni Buddha. And it's basically a spiritual lineage, record of a spiritual lineage from Shakyamuni Buddha through Dogen Zenji, who's one of the founders of our lineage. And it was compiled by someone called Keizan Zenji. And he was three generations past Dogen, which we're talking 1200s, 1300s in Japan. And Keizan's, he was responding to politics at the time, as all things do. And he was keen to demonstrate that Zen practice went back to Shakyamuni Buddha. There was some talk or some kind of some thoughts that it was a newer practice that really didn't go all the way back to the Buddha. And his aim in part was to demonstrate that it did. And each of the cases in the Denko Roku is the awakening experience of the next ancestor. So I was thinking about it's like I think most of us were probably in elementary school where you did those relay races where you have the stick and you're waiting for the person to hand you the stick and then you run your lap and then you hand it to the next person. Well, that's kind of what the Denko Roku is, of the transmission of the light from one ancestor to the next. And of course, the important thing to mention in that is there is nothing that's transmitted. It's more of a confirmation that we are whole and complete as we are. And that only comes from ourselves. So the transmission of the light is it's the authorization in some ways to teach and to share that understanding with others, but it's not getting anything from anybody else, which is a really, really important part of our practice. And the other thing about this spiritual family tree is that there's only one person that's recorded in each generation. And we, as much as I am not an academician, but I am aware that we are aware that there are multiple people in many generations. So why this particular patriarch, and this is a lineage of patriarchs, is mentioned, is highlighted as their awakening experience, I don't know. And I don't know if we all know that for sure. So it's limited from that perspective of all what's being recorded. the other thing that I wanted to mention um, around that is that because in the morning service, after the second service, um, the relative and absolute, we chant the lineage chart, and today we did the traditional, the patriarchal lineage chart, and then the female our women ancestors. And that's a lot of names. And if you haven't done it before, or even if you have, it's a lot. And most of which, the Chinese part, I have an extremely difficult time pronouncing. Um, Even though the phonetic interpretation is there, I'm still, trying to hum along. But what's really amazing and important about that, and that's why I wanted to share it with you, because we did that all together, is why do we do that? And really it's honoring the efforts of those who came before us. And in some actual very real way, we all wouldn't be sitting here without them. We have received this teaching through 2,500 plus years of time. And it is the effort of those who struggled in the same ways that we do to want to understand what their lives were really about, and applied themselves in that way, and then took it on the responsibility to share that with others and encourage others. And it's what results in us being here. So lineage, at least in our Japanese lineage, is actually a pretty important part. It's something that a lot of regard goes into, and that's why, I just felt like it's important to, why are we chanting all these people's names that we don't know who they are, and they're hard to pronounce. And first we go through the Indian ancestors, and then we do the Chinese ancestors, and then the Japanese, and then to the American. So I just kind of wanted to share a little bit about that. And as you know, if you stick around and get to know these folks a little bit, sometimes then certain of their stories are more meaningful to you than others. So the identity of relative and absolute, that's what that chant is. And it really relates very much to this koan. So, so from what I understand, there isn't a whole bunch known about this particular ancestor. But if we can imagine, this is a teacher and a student, and the teacher asks the student, what's the business beneath the patched robe? So that, for a priest like Shoyu, that would be the kesa that he's referring to. For myself as a layperson, and those of us wearing a rakusu, this would be the patched robe. But really, it's what is most central? What's under here? What's inside here? Who am I? And the student doesn't answer. Now, one thing I wanted to point out is that, sometimes we say it's better to have nothing than something good, or I don't know. But for those of you doing koan study, it's better to say something than nothing at times, because the whole point is to expose ourselves, what we understand, what we don't understand. And that can't happen with the teacher if you hold back. So in this situation, I don't know what Ryozan and Kanai, obviously don't know what he was feeling, thinking, understanding at the time. All we know is he didn't respond. It could have been that he had something to share, but he could have just felt intimidated, or not sure of himself in that moment, which is something I'm sure we can all relate with. But all we know is that he didn't respond. And so the teacher pretty pointedly says, um, studying the Buddha way and still not reaching this realm is the most painful thing. So for those of us, and I'm going to assume and include all of us here, there are many other ways that you could spend your day today. And I can only assume that if you felt like making a lot of money and having a lot of material possessions was the most important way for you to clarify what your life was about, that you would go to a workshop on financial development. And that's a fine thing to do as well. But you came to the workshop on what's beneath the patch robe. That's what our practice is all about. Who am I? What is this? What is this fundamental nature? What is this sense that I have a longing or a calling towards? And I, like I said, I would be so audacious, bold, maybe make a wrong assumption that nobody spends the amount of time that you've spent in this day in this Zazen Kai without having some kind of compelling question along these lines. And that's beautiful. Really wanting to understand what our life is. And the master says, no, I mean, this is, in my mind, just if I put myself into this situation, just this amazingly kind thing his teacher says to him, which is, you ask me. You ask me. And his response is intimacy. I'm going to share with you a little bit from Maizumi Roshi's Teisho on the chant of the relative and absolute. And Roshi says that the word in Japanese for intimacy is mitsu, M-I-T-S-U, which I'm just loving that word. Mitsu. It feels very intimate, mitsu. So I'm just gonna offer up, because I'm not gonna get to all of this. I just want to offer up the contemplation of intimacy as so deep and includes everything. And of course, it's like intimate with what, intimate how. So just share something from my own life experience of about a week ago. So I mentioned the sore hip from the backpack, wearing the backpack. And I was in pretty high elevation in the Sierras, between 10 and 11,000 feet. And the main trees up there are these white bark pine that are just pretty stunning from the perspective of, there's this big center, for the ones that look like they're really old, have this big center kind of burl. And then there's trees coming up from that, each of which could be its own tree, but they're all coming from the same center root. And they're in really very austere kind of setting. And this one that I found, it had 18 of those branches coming up from it. So the tree had to be hundreds of years old. And my experience of being there just with this tree was of tremendous intimacy. I can't do what it does. it's stunning to me how it lives in that environment and produces oxygen. I mean, it does more in its lifetime than I could do. But so my point here is that intimacy is not limited to with other people, with other species. This is this absolute intimacy of life. And one of the ways that Maizumi Roshi talks about it in the identity of relative and absolute is interpenetration. So some of us have talked earlier in the day about, wanting to understand my fundamental nature. And how does my fundamental nature relate with this, usual consciousness that we're all quite aware of, and all its foibles and joys. And Maizumi Roshi talks about the interpenetration of the relative and the absolute. So this life that we are very conscious of living and conscious of all our challenges with is the same as this fundamental nature. That's the intimacy of relative and absolute. So I want to read you a few aspects of Maizumi Roshi's Teisho on this, and this is available to everybody. This is from the book that is a collection of his talks called Appreciate Your Life. So this is so important. Appreciate your life, the essence of Zen practice. So he's talking about this. So this gives some background on the identity of relative and absolute, that chant that we did this morning, the second chant, because he talks about it at the beginning. Intimacy is one of the basic themes expressed in the poem, Identity of Relative and Absolute, written by Master Sakito Kisen, a Zen master in the 8th century China. So isn't that kind of amazing too? We're chanting this chant from the 8th century China. And it begins, the mind of the great sage of India is intimately conveyed from west and east. Among human beings are wise ones and fools. In the way, there is no, we have an ancestor of north and south, teacher of north and south. And he says the implication of identity is not just that two things are one, but there is just the activity of being one. There is the activity of intimacy between relative and absolute. And then he says the two interact, and yet they are one. Being one is the activity of intimacy. So there's a bunch more in here that I'd love to read to you. But sometimes I think saying too much, it gets washed out. So really something very fundamental to, and this is, from a Mahayana perspective, which then is comes, as Mahayana practice, is already we are whole and complete as we are. That's what we awaken to, is what's already true. Already your birthright, already my birthright, already our birthright. And so our whole practice is really about being intimate with everything we find, everything we encounter along the way is the expression of this whole and complete reality. When it's me lying on the sofa, kind of feeling like I want to start crying because I wish I could be with my son and Famora, that's being intimate with my nature. And then it passes, and then I'm like, okay, You get to go be with the folks in the Zazen Kai at 3:30. It's everything. It's including everything. And the whole and all of who we are is boundless and depthless. And I don't know if we ever really understand that. But this is important because Roshi talks about this. Really be intimate with no division between yourself and others. Then everything becomes nothing but you. Trust yourself as you truly are. You already are the Buddha way itself. Be intimate. Do not make yourself separate with your opinions, your judgments, your ideas, mostly about ourselves, with whatever you think your life is. If there is any difficulty, it is simply the difficulty of how to be intimate with ourselves. And then I thought this was really important. I wanted to kind of leave you with this. I want you to be a truly intimate being. Beneath the robe is the same as outside the robe. Inside and outside the robe are one. So when Ryosan Enkin is asked, what about you? And then we're talking about under the patched robe, intimacy, and then take that farther. It's not just under the patched robe. It's nothing but everything. And then we start to really open up to how big this life is. And that's where our practice of wisdom and compassion are completely related. Because when we really see into the intimacy of this life, compassion naturally rises. Because we are actually for real connected to it, not just as an idea. So I'm very, very grateful for your practice. And let's just keep going through the evening. And yeah, be really intimate with who you really are. I'll read you the poem at the end. There's always a poem at the end of these. The water is clear to the very bottom. The pearl gleams naturally, without need of cutting or polishing. That's you.